Is there something you look out for when you're reading other people's articles and other, maybe within CoinDesk or without CoinDesk, that you look for as either a telltale sign that they're shilling, or the opposite, where you're like, well, this feels like a really, really objective and good article?
I really like to look at the sourcing. So a lot of articles, if for example they're only quoting one person and that one person works for a specific party, then I'm probably going to give it less weight than I would to an article that quotes different parties and different people that are working for different companies and who don't have the same kind of vested interest. For the policy stuff, by its nature, a lot of DC stories tend to be kind of, according to a source who is familiar with the matter. You don't see a lot of necessarily like, firsthand reporting. You see just kind of, well, this person is a staffer who works for some agency. And so I'll try and look for, you know, does it plausible that they will understand the information that they say? So, for example, a congressional staffer uh, generally knows a lot about what's going on in their boss's office. They don't necessarily know too much about what's going on in other agencies. Or if they do, how are they phrasing it? Is it, well, this is what I'm hearing versus this is what for sure is happening? And these are kind of like subtle things, but I think you can really learn a lot about, where the source of an article has, getting their information from and whether or not that makes sense. And then I also look at sometimes the outlet itself. There's some outlets, I'm not going to name them, but there's some outlets that I'm sure you're familiar with that, you don't necessarily need to, spend a lot of attention to. They're going to write something, they're going to move on, they're not going to bother fact checking. Other outlets, especially in crypto, I think there's some outlets that I really do pay a lot of attention to. Um, ones that they're going to have some level of fact checking. And then the legacy media outlets or mainstream media outlets, however you want to call them, mixed bag. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Some of them have good reporters, some of them have bad reporters. And yeah, you never really know what you're going to get until, again, you look at the sourcing, you look at who they're quoting, who they're naming, who they're not naming, and why they may or may not be naming these folks.
One thing you had said before was that sometimes you'll see policy or DC crypto related stories that get a lot of attention, but that aren't actually that important. Do you have any examples that you can point to or any commonalities between those types of stories?
So, one example I'll go to, and I'm not going to say that this is not as important, but maybe the attention it's getting is perhaps not focused the right way. So, Senator Cynthia Lummis is a huge figure in crypto, and she and Senator, I forget if it was Gillibrand or Cinema, but recently introduced a bill to, it was a very wide ranging crypto bill, and it got like so much attention and hype. I would say it is important, but the hype it's getting is kind of disproportionate to what it actually signifies. So that bill, as it stands, I don't think is ever going to get passed, and I don't think even the sponsors expect it to get passed. What is likely is that it's going to start a conversation. Other lawmakers are going to look at it, and then some parts of it might get passed in different bills, and so it's kind of like an important bill, but in the sense that it's a framing bill for the actual crypto policy and legislation that might happen in the future. But the attention it got and the way the attention was focused was like, oh, well, these two senators are going to try and pass this huge crypto bill that's going to do X, Y, Z. And you saw pro crypto people saying like, wow, this is great for the industry and all this stuff is going to, single-handedly legitimize crypto in the eyes of the world. And you saw a lot of crypto critics saying, all right, well, this is like, a lobbyist, a corporate like bought for and paid for bill. And I don't think either of these takes is necessarily accurate. I think that what's going to happen is we're going to see a lot of conversation start because of this bill. And that is the true significance, is that it is placing a marker down and saying, all right, well, crypto is here. It's going to do stuff, but here's how we got to look at it. And people are going to disagree with that. People are going to agree with that. But it is starting a conversation in a way that hadn't necessarily happened prior to that. For example, we're now hearing that there might actually be a stablecoin bill that's passed this year. And that conversation, I think, was probably started by Senator Pat Toomey earlier this year. He introduced a bill to try and define stablecoin legislation. And that bill didn't really get a lot of pickup from his colleagues in the Senate. But now we're hearing the House might have a bill, and when the Senate gets around to it, he's probably going to be a pretty influential figure, voice in that because he's already got this document out there. And when this becomes a law, we'll be able to say, okay, well, this started because of X, Y, Z. I think that's probably like the easiest way for me to kind of explain this is that, and this is certainly, part of the issue is how reporters look at it. And, I'm going to not exempt my own team from that. Certainly how we look at it is that sometimes what gets hype and clicks is not necessarily the stuff that should.
And what you're talking about here is kind of something I've sometimes struggled with when I try to discuss policy or politics or legislature and things like that, is trying to kind of separate out what's kind of signaling and shaping and what's like actually a legitimate attempt to get enough votes to get a bill through the two houses. And those two things are different, but like when a bill is being introduced, a bill is being introduced. And so the process looks the same for those two, even though politically they're meant to kind of achieve two very different things. And that's true, I think, often when you're talking about like regulators and stuff too. The speeches of like the individual regulators are them like signaling or kind of messaging what territory they want, but isn't necessarily like their current mandate or things like that. So I often find like when trying to discuss these things, it can be challenging to really kind of separate that out and talk about that. Do you have any additional thoughts on like how reporters, media, or whatever should message around that kind of thing, and like the separating out like this is a thing that is actually likely to pass, or this is these people negotiating and trying to vie for power or to mold or shape certain things?
That's a really good question. It's certainly one that we struggle with, or at least I struggle with, because sometimes it might kind of like seem obvious to to me or my colleagues that, all right, well, this bill's not going to go anywhere, but we can't necessarily say that because we don't know for sure. It's just a gut feeling that we have based on our experience. And so I struggle with how to explain that in a way that doesn't seem, condescending or rude, but also isn't just kind of, voice of God type thing. So I don't know that I have an answer necessarily. I think, certainly we have to do a better job explaining what we know and why we know it, and saying, okay, well, this bill was introduced. It is likely to do X, Y, Z. It is starting a conversation. I do think we do an okay job at saying, okay, well, here's what needs to happen for it to become a law. So it needs to get support from, both houses, needs to get support from the president, needs to get, X number of votes in each body. This process is going to take a while. And the other weird part is that because of the way congressional terms work, for example, I was mentioning Pat Toomey earlier. He has, at this point, 4.5 months to really get anything done because he is retiring at the end of his term. And he'll be replaced by either John Fetterman or Mehmet Oz, and I have no idea what either of those two individuals thinks about crypto. So the entire clock is going to really reset in January, and we're going to have to start again and say, okay, well, these lawmakers have XYZ views on crypto. These bills might get introduced. These bills might not get introduced, and we don't know what the count is going or what the votes are going to look like. So that's the other thing we have to play around with, is just trying to figure out, all right, what's possible, what is plausible within the next 4 or 5 months. And then what are we looking at after that?